Hello. I'm speaking with Dr. Ezekiel Escura, the most recent winner of the AAAS Science Diplomacy Award. Dr. Ezekiel, please share with us some of the work you've done to receive such a prestigious award.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm incredibly thankful to the AAAS for the award that, quite frankly, I don't want to fake false modesty, but I didn't expect at all. I became involved with international issues, and especially collaboration, during my PhD research. For reasons that have to do with my interests and possibility of finding funding for my research, I started working in a wonderful place in Mexico that is called the Gran Desierto de Altar, the Great Desert, which is this corridor of land that goes from the state of Sonora to the lower Colorado River and the peninsula of Baja California, which is, together with the Death Valley, the most extreme desert in North America. And working there, I realized how difficult interaction between the two countries had been historically. Um, the obstacles that had been met both in Mexico City and in DC by federal authorities to collaborate more for the protection, the conservation of the borderlands, of the incredible biodiversity of the borderlands. Added to that, there is an additional problem in that area, which is the existence of the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham that are normally known in Western cultures as Papago Indians. The Tohono O'odham are a binational tribe that were crossed in the middle by the establishment of the border in 1852. But they have constituents and members of the indigenous nation of both sides of the border, and for them the Great Desert is a sacred site. And of course, initially, when they heard about the possibility of creating a protected area, they were like hostile to the idea because they were afraid of losing their sacred site. And, and so I suddenly found that apart from being a researcher, as I developed love for this region, if we wanted to protect the region, we needed to do something more, to interact with the Tohono O'odham traditional legislative authorities. That was the easy part because they live there in the desert. So I started interacting with them. And also to interact with authorities in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City, which is the more complicated part because bureaucracies can be heavy and difficult to deal with. And so that was the time when I started working apart from doing my own research, I started working in interacting between nations and cultures to try and protect an area of extraordinary biological richness.
That's fantastic. Incredibly interesting that you were able to use, your love for science and to spark this additional interest in culture to really add a new section of like intersectionality to what you were doing. It started in research and then just spread into diplomacy. I'm very curious, like, what were some of the challenges like working between the government in Mexico and the United States government, throughout the years?
Well, the border challenges were very strong at that time, and they're still, unfortunately, they're still complicated. Um, at that time, I found, let me start with an anecdotal but fun part of it. Uh, for the for the Papago people, for the Tohono O'odham, uh, the Great Desert has one wonderful pilgrimage route, which is a coming of age event for them. When kids turn around 16 or 17, they have to walk from what is now their traditional lands near Lukeville in Arizona. They have to cross the desert on foot, go to the coast of the Gulf of California, the legendary Sea of Cortez, There's a beautiful salt flat there, and they have to collect salt and bring back, go back to to their tribe with a bag of salt. It's a salt pilgrimage, and that's like a coming of age thing. And they hadn't done it for a while because of border difficulties and things like that. And one of the first things at that time I was 30, so young, and we organized a pilgrimage in which I participated, so they wouldn't be bothered by authorities on the Mexican side. I had all the paperwork and all that stuff, and it was amazing. It was really amazing because the border salt flats are littered with centuries, I would say millennia, of artifacts, shell middens, um, uh, clay pottery shards, and things like that. And for these guys, doing what their ancestors have done for thousands of years was like a total epiphany. It was amazing. And that simple act, which is a lot of fun too, really opened doors for me with elders in the tribe. That's where we started working with the elders. In Mexico City, there was a concern about national parks in the border, protected areas in the border. And the federal government didn't want anything in terms of protected areas in the border because they were afraid that by leaving areas empty, unprotected, they would lose sovereignty. And they didn't want them. So I started working with Mexico City authorities, and also at that time, for a while, there wasn't a lot of interest in the U.S. federal government either. There wasn't a hostility, but there wasn't a lot of interest. Basically, because the northern counterpart of Gran Desierto is an Air Force gunnery and bombing range, and so they were not really too interested in making sister parks at that time. But you know, a friend of mine once said, uh, the good thing about being an environmentalist is that you develop patience. You have a perception for deep time, the Darwinian idea of evolutionary time. He said, you have all of evolution, all of history in front of you. So that's what we did. We started working um, without stopping with the Mexican federal government and the U.S. government, and I maintained my collaboration with Tohono O'odham. And 12 years after I started working in the region, uh, there was an opening. There was the Minister of the Environment in Mexico was Luis Donaldo Colosio, a person I really loved a lot and a wonderful guy. And he was from Magdalena, very near the border, a very nice, pretty colonial city near the border in Sonora. And he had a love for the border and for the ecosystems. I joked with him, he could appreciate the smell of a creosote bush, that not everybody can. And Bruce Babbitt, former governor of Arizona, great conservationist to this day, was Secretary of the Interior. And Mexico was trying to do quote unquote good environmental things because of proximity of the signature of NAFTA, because of the NAFTA negotiations. So we just put everything together, and Colosio took me to see President Salinas, and I said, you know what? We have been working for 12 years on this protected area. If you decree it as a protected, you know, the native people, the Papago want it now. They're really eager to have it. If you decree it, it will actually give you an amazing image internationally. And Salinas caught it like that, and it was decreed. That was my baptism in scientific diplomacy. But of course, by that time we had published a lot of papers. There was a lot of background information. There was good research behind, so we could get it done.
So would you say that having, that foundation in research really, accelerate your ability to effectively communicate the diplomatic side, to be able to show having that research and say, like, we have proof that this work is important. How did that work with diplomats and fighting with different politics of the nature?
Well, that's a complicated thing because traditional diplomats, unfortunately, and I have to say this in front of Stefania, who is has received her formation as a traditional diplomat working at the embassy. But sometimes traditional diplomats work on strategy and are not so permeable to science. Let me give you one example that I find really very fascinating. In 1994, because of all the things we had done together, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, at the time it was directed by an incredible woman by the name of Molly Betty, they suggested my name as scientific president of the CITES convention for that year. And so it was like an incredible experience to be scientific president of CITES during the plenary, the conference of the parties. But there we wanted to have some sort of international protection for precious woods. Things like mahogany, for example. Um, things like rosewood. All these tropical precious woods that in many parts are disappearing very, very fast because of the international market, we wanted to protect them. And at that time, the representatives of Brazil, who are amazing diplomats, Brazilians are extraordinary diplomats, but they take no prisoners. They go to what they want to do. They opposed it, and they were able to prevent the international regulation to protect tropical woods. But then things happened. A few years later, Lula da Silva came, who was a progressive and a liberal, and Lula was in favor of protecting precious tropical woods because that would help, especially the native people in the Amazon. And we had the same governmental officers, the same diplomats that were opposing the protection of tropical woods, proposing now and defending the protection of tropical woods. What I want to say here is basically the reflection I want to make, apart from the irony of it all, that is a little bit fun, but is that sometimes traditional diplomats defend what their country says, independently of what scientific rationale tells them that should be defended. The good thing about being a scientist and defending principles based on hard data and information is that you achieve a high level of credibility. I have always been surprised. You know, in Mexico, university professors and researchers, this has been tested with interviews and surveys at a national level, are the people in the country that have the highest credibility.
Oh, wow.
People believe university professors. Sometimes I think too much, knowing some of my colleagues and myself, but people believe university professors and researchers. And so trying to do diplomacy when you have a long-term mission is wonderful. And sometimes it will allow you to achieve great things.
That's incredible. What would be some of your advice you would give to someone who might be in a position of, academic credibility, like you mentioned, that wanted to get more into diplomacy because they see an issue and they would like to work with the governmental institutions, around whether it's domestic or international, to really affect change? What advice would you give to those individuals?
Well, I discuss that very often with my graduate students, with graduate students in my campus. You know, the world has changed in the last 20 years in the world of academia in an incredible way. And I'm very often very surprised in a pleasant way to see how graduate students have evolved also. My advice is, apart from doing good science, which is always at the base of being a scientist, I expect young scientists to devote more time to outreach and scientific dissemination, even scientific journalism. It's so important because, unfortunately, the President of the Republic doesn't read Science or Nature or PNAS or whatever, but they do read magazines and newspapers, and they're informed by their agencies of what has come out in newspapers. So having your voice being heard in more popular media is very important, independently of the fact that, of course, I, I, I support and endorse strict publication and the peer-reviewed system and all that, and I compete in that system myself. But devoting some time to science popularization is really, really important. And then, so my first advice is try and maintain an equilibrium between teaching, hard science, and, and scientific outreach. Outreach is extremely important. The scientists that have been heard in the last decades have always been people that have devoted some of their effort to dissemination of their ideas and outreach. I think that's probably the most important advice. And then the second advice is, if you have a dream, that you think that from your own research you can actually produce a change in the world, follow it. Because again, publishing in my beloved ecology or ecological applications or whatever won't actually change the world on its own. You need to complement it with wider things.
That's incredible. I think that's great advice for, especially the attendees at this conference who are all interested in science and making an impact and communicating those scientific needs throughout disciplines, whether it's theoretical, mathematics, to environmental studies. What's something that you hope to see in the next, 20 years in the area that you studied and focused on? What's, your dream of how can we improve that area in the next like 20 years, but diplomatically?
Uh,
In the next 6 minutes, you keep us on time. I feel like that could be a whole
yeah,
dissertation.
yeah. It's a tough time. As a parent of 4 kids, um, some of whom are very, very involved in science issues, others are involved in teaching. Uh, it's a difficult time. Um, and in the area that I probably love the most, which is the deserts of North America, that lie both sides of the border, it's an even more difficult time. The border wall, the distrust between two societies, the militarization of the border has made ecological conservation pass to a second level, to a lower priority. Of course, that at the border level, and globally, I don't need to say much, but the challenge of a rapidly changing biosphere, I think is huge. And interesting enough, all millennials, all the younger kids that are starting their life in science seem to be aware of this and seem to be taking a commitment on, on these challenges. Again, my advice is almost remorseful, is as a generation we have done our best, but we have not succeeded always. And we need to actually start working together more. We need to demolish not only those physical walls, but those mental barriers that block dialogue between society. And in that sense, I think science and research play a fundamental role, because almost by nature, scientists are almost pariahs. They don't have, at least intellectually, they don't have a nation. They believe in a broader world of ideas and cooperation and interaction. So I think that science has a great role to play if we are going to solve some of the conundrums that we're going to be facing in the next 20 years.
Dr. Ezekiel Escara, thank you so much for joining us here at the AAAS annual meeting on the Expo stage. We really appreciate your time. And again, congratulations on your award. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very
Congratulations.
much. I'm very, very thankful to the AAAS for what I believe to be an undeserved recognition, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.